Legends say that beneath the left paw of the Great Sphinx lies a door, a sealed, high-tech vault, hiding the forbidden history of humanity, the Hall of Records. For centuries, mainstream archaeologists dismissed this as pure mythology, a fantasy, until the instruments proved the room was actually there. The instruments did not lie. In April 1991, 19 seismic sensors were arranged in a careful perimeter around the base of the Great Sphinx of Giza. The geologist and the seismologist who positioned them were not treasure hunters. They were not mystics. They were credentialed scientists conducting a peer-reviewed subsurface survey for a paper that would be published in Geoarchaeology, one of the most respected journals in the field. Their methodology was standard. Their equipment was calibrated. Their results were unambiguous. Beneath the left front paw of the Sphinx, at a depth of approximately 5 meters, the instruments recorded a void, 12 meters by 9 meters, the size of a modest apartment, sitting in silence beneath the single most scrutinized archaeological monument on Earth. That paper has now been in the scientific record for over 30 years. In those 30 years, no borehole has been drilled into the void. No camera has been lowered through the limestone. No human being has laid eyes on whatever that space contains or does not contain. Every formal request to investigate has been denied by the Egyptian government. 34 years, 1 peer-reviewed detection, 0 follow-up. The reason is not what most people assume. It is not bureaucratic caution, though caution exists. It is not conservation concern, though the monument is genuinely fragile. The real reason involves a psychic who died in Virginia in 1945. A live television broadcast watched by 10 million people that was largely staged, and the single most powerful figure in the history of Egyptian archaeology, a man who controlled access to the Sphinx for nearly 3 decades. Beneath all of that, the bedrock holds whatever it holds. The instruments have spoken. Their data is not in dispute. What remains in dispute is what it means, and whether anyone will ever be permitted to find out. Begin with the stone itself. The Sphinx sits on the Giza plateau on the western outskirts of Cairo, carved from the living bedrock of the Mokattam Formation, a Middle Eocene limestone deposited roughly 50 million years ago when a shallow sea covered this part of North Africa. It faces due east, precisely due east, aligned to the equinoctial sunrise with an accuracy that suggests deliberate astronomical intent, though scholars argue whether that intent was calendrical, ceremonial, or something older and less easily categorized. Its dimensions are not subtle. 73 meters from tail to outstretched paws, 20 meters from base to crown. The face alone is 4 meters wide. It is the largest monolithic statue on Earth, not assembled from blocks, not constructed from quarried pieces transported to site, but carved downward and outward from a single prominence of natural limestone that already existed in the plateau. The workers who carved it did not build the Sphinx. They revealed it. They removed everything that was not Sphinx until the form that remained was this one. That distinction between construction and revelation matters more than it might initially seem. A built monument can be dismantled. A revealed monument is the rock itself. Whatever is beneath it is beneath the plateau. To reach it, you do not excavate around it. You excavate through it or beneath it, or you find the openings that already exist. And the openings, as it turns out, do exist. The archaeological consensus, supported by stratigraphic evidence, ceramic typology, and contextual analysis of the surrounding quarry and temple complex, dates the carving of the Sphinx to the reign of Khafre, approximately 2500 BC. The Sphinx, on this reading, is roughly 4,500 years old. It was carved in the 4th dynasty. It stood complete while the pyramids beside it were still being finished. This is the consensus. Hold it in mind, because one of the scientists who conducted the 1991 Void Survey would later present geological evidence that places the carving of the Sphinx body not at 2500 BC, but potentially as far back as 7000 to 9000 BC. That evidence has never been formally refuted on geological grounds. It has simply been set aside, but that argument belongs to a later passage in this story. For now, the stone. Pause here, because before we can understand what might be hidden beneath the Sphinx, we have to understand something that most visitors to the plateau never learn, something that changes the entire shape of the mystery. The Sphinx is not sealed. The geologist and the seismologist who positioned them were not treasure hunters. They were not mystics. They were credentialed scientists conducting a peer-reviewed subsurface survey for a paper that would be published in Geoarchaeology, one of the most respected journals in the field. Their methodology was standard. Their equipment was calibrated. Their results were unambiguous. Beneath the left front paw of the Sphinx, at a depth of approximately 5 meters, the instruments recorded a void, 12 meters by 9 meters, the size of a modest apartment, sitting in silence beneath the single most scrutinized archaeological monument on Earth. That paper has now been in the scientific record for over 30 years. In those 30 years, no borehole has been drilled into the void. No camera has been lowered through the limestone. No human being has laid eyes on whatever that space contains or does not contain. Every formal request to investigate has been denied by the Egyptian government. 34 years, 1 peer-reviewed detection, 0 follow-up. The reason is not what most people assume. It is not bureaucratic caution, though caution exists. It is not conservation concern, though the monument is genuinely fragile. The real reason involves a psychic who died in Virginia in 1945. A live television broadcast watched by 10 million people that was largely staged, and the single most powerful figure in the history of Egyptian archaeology, a man who controlled access to the Sphinx for nearly 3 decades. Beneath all of that, the bedrock holds whatever it holds. The instruments have spoken. Their data is not in dispute. What remains in dispute is what it means, and whether anyone will ever be permitted to find out. Begin with the stone itself. The Sphinx sits on the Giza plateau on the western outskirts of Cairo, carved from the living bedrock of the Mokattam Formation, a Middle Eocene limestone deposited roughly 50 million years ago when a shallow sea covered this part of North Africa. It faces due east, precisely due east, aligned to the equinoctial sunrise with an accuracy that suggests deliberate astronomical intent, though scholars argue whether that intent was calendrical, ceremonial, or something older and less easily categorized. Its dimensions are not subtle. 73 meters from tail to outstretched paws, 20 meters from base to crown. The face alone is 4 meters wide. It is the largest monolithic statue on Earth, not assembled from blocks, not constructed from quarried pieces transported to site, but carved downward and outward from a single prominence of natural limestone that already existed in the plateau. The workers who carved it did not build the Sphinx, they revealed it. They removed everything that was not Sphinx until the form that remained was this one. That distinction between construction and revelation matters more than it might initially seem. A built monument can be dismantled. A revealed monument is the rock itself. Whatever is beneath it is beneath the plateau. To reach it, you do not excavate around it. You excavate through it, or beneath it, or you find the openings that already exist. And the openings, as it turns out, do exist. The archaeological consensus, supported by stratigraphic evidence, ceramic typology, and contextual analysis of the surrounding quarry and temple complex, dates the carving of the Sphinx to the reign of Khafra, approximately 2500 BC. The Sphinx on this reading is roughly 4,500 years old. It was carved in the 4th dynasty. It stood complete while the pyramids beside it were still being finished. This is the consensus. Hold it in mind, because one of the scientists who conducted the 1991 Void Survey would later present geological evidence that places the carving of the Sphinx body not at 2500 BC, but potentially as far back as 7000 to 9000 BC. That evidence has never been formally refuted on geological grounds. It has simply been set aside, but that argument belongs to a later passage in this story. For now, the stone. Pause here, because before we can understand what might be hidden beneath the Sphinx, we have to understand something that most visitors to the plateau never learn, something that changes the entire shape of the mystery. The Sphinx is not sealed. 7 openings penetrate its body and immediate surroundings. They have been documented across centuries of exploration. They are not secret. They are not disputed. They are simply not discussed in the guides and the glossy books and the tourist pamphlets, because they complicate the clean narrative of an intact monument, standing unchanged since the age of the pharaohs. The first opening sits at the crown of the head, designated Shaft A in the archaeological literature, roughly 5 feet square and 6 feet deep. First described by the German traveler Johann Helfferich in 1565, which means it existed before modern Egyptology, before Napoleon's expedition, before the systematic excavation of the plateau. It was likely carved during the New Kingdom, approximately 1,000 years after the original construction, to anchor a ceremonial headdress ornament. In 1926, the French engineer Émile Barrès, who spent 11 years excavating and restoring the Sphinx, paved the shaft with cement and fitted it with a metal trap door that remains visible today. Barrès's work deserves a moment of careful attention because it established a pattern that would repeat throughout the 20th century. Excavation followed by closure, discovery followed by documentation, documentation followed by silence. Between 1925 and 1936, Barrès cleared approximately 6,000 tons of sand from around the Sphinx enclosure. 6,000 tons. Moved by hand by rope and basket, by the slow labor of men working in desert heat over 11 consecutive years. He found the Sphinx in a state of severe deterioration, its paws crumbling, its chest eroding, its flanks displaying what he described in his field notes as deep fissures of uncertain origin. He photographed what he found. He mapped the passages he entered. And then, systematically, he sealed most of what he had opened. The precise record of what he found, and, more specifically, what he found inside, is not fully available in any public archive. His photographs survive. His general correspondence survives. But the detailed field notebooks, the day-by-day record of what the excavation revealed as it descended through 11 years of accumulated sand and debris, have never been fully published. They remain in an archive in Cairo. Access to external researchers has been restricted in ways that scholars have noted, but that no official explanation has been offered to justify. That gap, the 11 years of Baraz's work for which the complete notes remain unpublished, is one of the quieter anomalies in the Sphinx's modern history. It is not dramatic. It is the opposite of dramatic. It is the absence of drama where drama, if the notes contain something significant, might be expected. The second and third openings are on the Sphinx's rump, two small vertical shafts that descend approximately 9 meters into the body. They were documented in 1926 by Baraz. Their purpose is unknown. They do not appear in older historical records, which implies either that they were created during a period of exploration between the medieval era and the 20th century, or that they predate modern documentation entirely. The shafts were examined, measured, and sealed. A fourth opening exists in the north flank, a horizontal tunnel, roughly a meter high, that penetrates approximately 15 meters into the body before terminating in a rough wall. It was first formally documented in the 1980s during a survey conducted by a joint Egyptian-American team. The tunnel shows signs of having been extended at some point and then deliberately backfilled. The backfill is composed of a different material than the surrounding limestone. Someone went in, went deeper, came back, and filled in what they had dug. Why? Hold that question. It does not have a clean answer, and the people who would have the best chance of answering it have, collectively, declined to do so. A fifth passage runs beneath the paws, connecting the dream stele. The granite inscription, placed between the Sphinx's outstretched paws by the pharaoh Thutmose IV, around 1400 BC, to a small chamber in the chest region. The dream stele records a story in which the young Thutmose, resting in the shadow of the Sphinx on a hunting expedition, receives a visitation in his sleep from the monument itself, which tells him it is buried in sand and asks to be cleared. Thutmose clears it. He becomes pharaoh. He erects a stele recording the event and has it placed permanently between the paws of the thing that spoke to him in his dreams. The stele is often cited as the earliest known text specifically about the Sphinx, but buried within its inscription is a line that has no consensus translation, a fragment in which the Sphinx appears to reference something beneath itself, something it is keeping. The fragment is damaged. Several scholars have argued that the damage is too uniform, too specifically located over that particular passage, to be entirely accidental. Others say this is reading intention into ordinary deterioration. The fragment has been examined. It has not been resolved. Scholars argue about whether the gap is structural or something else entirely. A sixth opening is in the rear haunches, documented but not fully explored, sealed and not revisited in any report that has entered the public record. A seventh has been described in expedition notes from the early 20th century, informal accounts that name a location but have not been corroborated in the peer-reviewed literature. Whether the seventh opening is real, or whether it is a misreading of a feature that belongs to one of the other six, is a question that cannot be answered without access that has not been granted. 7 known openings. None leading to anything that has been fully excavated, fully mapped, or fully published. Every one of them sealed, backfilled, or simply not followed to its end. The monument holds its architecture of incomplete investigations, like a filing cabinet where every drawer has been opened exactly far enough to confirm something is inside, and then pushed closed again. This is the context in which the 1991 survey must be understood. The survey was not the first, it was the fourth, and the most precise. But the three that preceded it had already established something that the scientific community had largely declined to discuss. In 1977, a team from Stanford Research Institute conducted an electromagnetic survey of the Sphinx and its surrounding plateau. Their equipment measured subsurface anomalies by sending radar pulses into the ground and mapping the return signatures. They detected anomalous cavities beneath the Sphinx enclosure floor, multiple anomalies distributed across the site. Their report was filed. It was not widely publicized. The Egyptian government did not authorize follow-up excavation. In 1978, a French team conducted a separate geophysical survey using resistivity measurements, a technique that maps variations in electrical conductivity in the subsurface, particularly effective at detecting voids and chambers in limestone. They found anomalies, multiple anomalies, including one directly beneath the left front paw area, that their instruments characterized as a significant void-like feature. Their report was filed. The Egyptian government did not authorize follow-up excavation. In 1987, a Japanese team from Waseda University conducted a third independent survey. Different technology, different team, same plateau. Their instruments detected hollow spaces beneath the Sphinx, including, again, anomalies in the area of the front left paw. The report was filed. The Egyptian government did not authorize follow-up excavation. 3 independent surveys, 3 separate teams from 3 separate countries, 3 different technologies, 3 sets of instruments detecting anomalous cavities in roughly the same region, 3 denials of follow-up access, and almost no coverage in the mainstream archaeological literature of the period. Not suppressed, simply unremarked upon, as though the accumulated weight of 3 consistent detections by 3 credentialed teams did not constitute a pattern worth publicly acknowledging. It was into this silence that Robert Schoch and Thomas Dobecki arrived in 1991. Schoch was a geologist from Boston University, specifically trained in subsurface analysis and rock weathering. Dobecki was a seismologist with expertise in the interpretation of acoustic wave returns through layered geological formations. They were not fringe researchers. They were not funded by any organization with an ideological stake in what they might find. They came with 19 seismic refraction instruments, the most precise technology that had been applied to the Sphinx's subsurface at that point, and they conducted their survey with full Egyptian authorization as part of a legitimate, peer-reviewed scientific project with no predetermined conclusion. The instruments were positioned in a careful grid around the monument's base. Seismic pulses were sent into the ground. The return signatures were mapped against the known density and composition of the surrounding Mokattam limestone. The analysis was rigorous and, in its final form, unambiguous. Beneath the left front paw, at a depth of approximately 5 meters, the instruments recorded a rectangular void, 12 meters by 9 meters. Natural dissolution chambers in limestone, the kind created by water moving through porous rock over millions of years, are irregular. They follow the path of least resistance through the rock. They are rounded at the edges, uneven in dimension, their profiles determined by the specific chemistry of the stone and the specific path of the water, rather than by any organizing principle of geometry. The void beneath the left front paw was rectangular, straight edges, consistent depth, right-angle corners, insofar as the resolution of the instruments could determine. The geometric regularity of a space that was shaped rather than formed. Schoch and Dobecki published their findings in Geoarchaeology in 1992. The paper is still available. The data is not in dispute. The void is real, or rather, the anomaly that behaves like a void when seismic pulses pass through it is real. Whether it is a natural feature or a constructed one is precisely the question that a borehole would answer. The borehole that has never been drilled. The Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities denied all requests for follow-up investigation. The 1992 denial was followed by further denials in 1996, in 2000, in 2006, and in 2009. Each time the question was formally raised by researchers, each time the answer was the same. The instruments have spoken. Their data is not in dispute, and no one has been allowed to find out what it means. But to understand why, truly understand why, beneath the bureaucratic surface, you have to go back further than 1991. You have to go back to 1932, to a man lying on a couch in Virginia Beach, to a reading that described, with a specificity that should have been impossible, a chamber beneath the left front paw of the Great Sphinx of Giza. Because the Egyptian authorities who denied access to the void were not simply protecting an archaeological site from careless investigation. They were, in part, protecting it from the people who wanted most desperately to find what the void contains. And those people had been looking for a very long time. And they had a name for what they were looking for. They called it the Hall of Records. Edgar Cayce did not look like a man who was dismantling the foundations of ancient history. He looked, by most accounts, like a mild-mannered Sunday school teacher from Hopkinsville, Kentucky, which is more or less what he was in the hours of the day when he was conscious. Soft-spoken, devout, unremarkable in his movements through the world. He worked as a photographer. He attended church. He answered his letters by hand and worried throughout most of his adult life about money. Then he would lie down on a couch, fold his hands across his stomach, close his eyes, and cease, in any meaningful sense, to be Edgar Cayce. What happened next was documented across 14,000 separate sessions between 1901 and 1945. Cayce would enter a self-induced trance. His breathing would slow and deepen until it was barely perceptible. His body would become still with a completeness that unnerved first-time observers. And then, in a voice his stenographers described as measured and clinical, quite unlike his ordinary, slightly southern waking speech, he would begin to speak. Most often he spoke about medicine. Patients who had never met him would send letters describing their symptoms, and Cayce, lying in his house in Virginia Beach with his eyes closed and the letter unread in another room, would describe their condition in anatomical terms with a precision that went well beyond anything a layperson in the early 20th century could be expected to know. He would name specific tissues, specific organs, specific biochemical processes. He would recommend treatments, sometimes conventional, sometimes unusual, occasionally things that did not exist in the pharmacopoeia of his time, but that subsequent decades of medical research would validate. He would specify the precise location of pathologies that had eluded the patient's own physicians. The accuracy rate was documented, studied, and, in many cases, verified by the treating doctors who followed his recommendations. This is not anecdote. The transcripts survive. The medical records survive. The Association for Research and Enlightenment, the organization Cayce founded to archive and study his readings, holds over 14,000 of them in a collection that has been examined by researchers from institutions including the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, a department established specifically to investigate claims of this kind through rigorous scientific methodology. Whether Edgar Cayce was genuinely accessing something beyond normal cognition, or whether he was an unusually gifted intuitive who had absorbed enough medical and scientific literature to produce coherent diagnoses in a state of focused dissociation, is a question that remains genuinely unresolved. The medical establishment has never endorsed him. It has also never been able to fully explain him. The cases that most resist debunking are the ones in which Cayce described, in specific physiological detail, conditions that the medical science of his time did not have the vocabulary to name, and which were confirmed only decades later by imaging technologies and diagnostic frameworks that did not exist when he made the readings. But the medical readings are not why he matters to this story. He matters because of what he said on the nights when the questions were not about medicine. In a series of readings conducted primarily between 1932 and 1935, Cayce described, in that same measured, clinical trance voice, a civilization he called Atlantis. Not the romantic literary Atlantis of Victorian fantasy, the sunken continent of drawing-room speculation and adventure novels. Something more specific and, in its specificity, more troubling. A civilization of considerable technological sophistication that had occupied a landmass in the Atlantic Ocean and reached its apex approximately 10,500 years before the Common Era. Its destruction, he said, was not a single catastrophic event, but a gradual dissolution, spread across several episodes of geological and social collapse, and its survivors had dispersed across the ancient world, carrying their knowledge with them into the cultures that would eventually become the civilizations we recognize from the historical record. Some had gone to the Yucatan, some to the Pyrenees, some to Egypt. And the ones who had gone to Egypt had done something before they died, or dispersed, or were absorbed into the population of the Nile Valley. They had preserved their civilization, not in oral tradition, which is fragile, subject to distortion, dependent on the continuity of living memory. Not in the memories of their descendants, who would forget. They had cut a chamber into the bedrock of the Giza plateau and placed inside it a physical record, documents, artifacts, instruments, of everything their civilization had known and achieved. A library, an archive, a time capsule carved in stone and sealed against the centuries. Cayce called it the Hall of Records, and he named its location with a specificity that would have been impossible to verify in 1932, and which became, 60 years later, an uncomfortable footnote in the peer-reviewed literature of subsurface geophysics. He said it lay beneath the left front paw of the Great Sphinx, at depth, sealed, waiting for the time when the knowledge it contained could be received. He said it would be discovered around the end of the 20th century, during a period of what he called spiritual and archaeological awakening, a time when, he suggested, humanity would have developed both the technological capacity to find the chamber and, potentially, the maturity to understand what it contained. The reading was transcribed by his stenographer, Grace Moore. It was filed. It is catalogued as reading number 5748-6 in the ARE archive, dated 1932. You can request a copy. 59 years later, Robert Schoch and Thomas Dubecki positioned 19 instruments around the base of the Sphinx and detected a rectangular void beneath the left front paw. This is not evidence that Cayce was right. The coordinates he named were not secret. The Sphinx's left front paw was a location that any reasonably attentive reader of earlier explorers' accounts could have identified as a point of archaeological interest. The possibility that Cayce arrived at his specific location through ordinary research, rather than extraordinary cognition, cannot be ruled out. It is also not nothing. It is the collision of two entirely different epistemologies, the scientific and the prophetic, at the same set of coordinates on the Giza plateau. And that collision is what transformed the Sphinx, in the eyes of the institutions that govern it, from an archaeological site into something considerably more politically complicated, because it meant that the people most motivated to investigate the void were not disinterested scientists. They were believers, and their belief had an institutional infrastructure, a funding apparatus, and a level of organized determination that the Egyptian archaeological establishment found over time both useful and deeply inconvenient. The ARE did not wait for 1991 to act on Cayce's reading. From the 1950s onward, the Association for Research and Enlightenment began directing funding, attention, and organizational energy toward Egypt, toward the Giza Plateau specifically, and toward the project of either confirming or locating what Cayce had described. They were explicit about this agenda. The ARE's publications from the period are unambiguous. They believed the Hall of Records existed. They believed it was beneath the Sphinx. and they believed that its discovery would constitute one of the most significant events in human intellectual history, transforming our understanding of both ancient civilization and the nature of consciousness itself. The challenge, of course, was access. Believing something and being permitted to excavate for it on the most scrutinized archaeological site in the world are entirely different categories of problem. The Egyptian government was not, in the 1950s and 1960s, in the habit of granting excavation permits to American psychic research organizations on the basis of trance readings from the 1930s. And so, in the early 1970s, the ARE found a more elegant approach. They did not try to excavate. They funded a scholar. His name was Mark Lehner. He was 22 years old, the son of ARE members, raised in a household where Cayce's readings were treated as serious historical documents. Not metaphor, not allegory, but genuine recovered memory of a civilization that had existed and left physical traces that could be found. He went to Egypt in 1973 on ARE funding, with what he later described, in a candor that speaks well of him, as the explicit intent of finding Atlantis. He did not find Atlantis. What he found instead was Egyptology. What happened to Mark Lehner over the following decades is, in some ways, the most quietly extraordinary transformation in this entire story, more extraordinary in its own way than the void itself. He arrived on the plateau as a believer in prophecy. He left as one of the foremost Egyptologists of the 20th century, a Harvard-educated scholar affiliated with the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, whose meticulous mapping of the Giza Plateau and its surrounding features, whose reconstruction of the ancient workman's village that housed the pyramid builders, and whose decades of patient, methodologically rigorous fieldwork have made him a figure of genuine, undisputed importance in the mainstream academic study of ancient Egypt. The transformation was not sudden. It was a slow, quiet replacement of prophetic expectation with archaeological reality. Year by year, the evidence accumulated that did not confirm what he had come to find, and the intellectual honesty required to follow the evidence rather than the framework that had brought him there is, in retrospect, something worth acknowledging. By the 1980s, Lehner had effectively separated himself from the ARE's agenda in his published academic work. He does not, in his scholarly writing, advocate for the Hall of Records. He does not cite Cayce. He applies the standard evidentiary methodologies of his discipline and publishes in peer-reviewed journals that subject his work to the same scrutiny applied to any other field researcher. And yet, the funding that brought him to Egypt came from the ARE. The initial access he gained to the Giza site in his early years was facilitated in part by the relationships and goodwill that the ARE had cultivated with Egyptian authorities over the preceding decades. The formative years of his field work, the years in which he developed the expertise and institutional credibility that would define his subsequent career, were built on a foundation that the academic establishment he eventually joined would find deeply uncomfortable to acknowledge. Scholars argue about how to weigh this. Some say it is entirely irrelevant, that a researcher's funding source does not determine the quality of their methodology, and that Lehner's mature work, stands entirely on its own merits, which are considerable. Others argue that it creates a structural conflict of interest that has never been fully addressed. A man who was funded to find a specific thing, who did not find it, who then became the primary academic authority on the site where the thing is supposedly located. The question of whether that history influenced, consciously or otherwise, his institutional position on access and investigation is not one that can be resolved from the outside. What can be documented is the pattern. The instruments detect anomalies. The requests to investigate are denied. And the people in the best position to authorize the investigation are, in each case, the people whose relationship to the potential findings is the most complicated. But Lehner is only part of the equation. There's another figure, the one who would ultimately concentrate more control over access to the Sphinx than any individual since the ancient world. A figure who understood the machinery of institutional archaeology with a sophistication that no geophysicist or ARE-funded researcher could match. A figure who had, himself, a complicated early relationship with the very organizations that were now pressing for access to the void. His name appears in almost every significant document related to the Sphinx from the 1980s onward. Zahi Hawass. And to understand why the instruments spoke and were not answered, to understand the precise shape of the silence, you have to understand what Zahi Hawass built over 3 decades on the Giza plateau, what he was protecting, and why. What, in a live television broadcast watched by 10 million people, he appeared to find in a passage beneath the Sphinx, and then, quietly, systematically, stopped talking about. The borehole that was never drilled, the camera that was never lowered, the passage that was opened in front of the entire watching world, and then sealed. But before we get to the broadcast, there is one more thread from Cayce's readings that needs to be held in your mind. Because Cayce did not only describe where the Hall of Records was located, he described what was inside it. He said it contained the complete history of Atlantis. Physical records, preserved in materials specifically engineered to survive indefinitely, including what he described as crystalline storage media, whose properties, he implied, were more sophisticated than anything in use in the civilization of his own time. He said it contained a comprehensive record of the origins of the human species, as understood by Atlantean science, a science that he suggested was, in certain domains, considerably more advanced than our own. He said it contained detailed technical knowledge of the nature of consciousness, not philosophical speculation about the mind, but applied information, the kind that could be used. He also said something that receives very little attention in the popular literature about the Hall of Records, but which is quietly significant when you consider the Egyptian government's decades of consistent denial. He said the Hall of Records was not meant to be opened until humanity was spiritually ready to receive what it contained, not politically ready, not technologically ready. The word he used consistently across multiple readings was spiritually. The Egyptian government has never cited this reason for denying access. No official communique from the Supreme Council of Antiquities has ever referenced the preparation of the human spirit as a criterion for excavation permits. But it is worth sitting with the possibility, carefully, without overreading it, that some of the people involved in those decisions carried, privately, a version of this concern. Not because they believed in Atlantis, but because they understood, with the clarity of people whose national identity is inseparable from the monuments they protect, what the discovery of a pre-pharaonic chamber beneath the Sphinx would do. It would not merely add to the story. It would revise the story at its foundation. Opening the Hall of Records, if it exists, does not just find a room. It unmakes a story, and the people who control the story have, with remarkable consistency, declined to open the room. There is a photograph that circulates in the more careful corners of Egyptological scholarship, not widely reproduced, not prominently displayed, but findable, if you know what to look for and are willing to look. It was taken in the mid-1970s on the Giza plateau. In it, a young Zahi Hawass stands beside Mark Lehner. They are both thin, both early in their careers, both standing in the dust of the plateau with the loose, unhurried posture of men who believe they have time, who believe that the thing they are working toward will eventually be found, that patience is merely the price of discovery, and that the plateau will eventually yield what it contains to the people who have committed themselves to it. Hawass was at that point an inspector for the Egyptian Antiquities Organization assigned to the Giza site. Lehner was there on his ARE-funded research. They were colleagues in the way that young men building careers in the same small, a specialized world become colleagues, sharing field equipment, comparing survey notes, spending long days in the same heat and dust, developing the kind of professional intimacy that extended fieldwork in a remote location tends to produce. Neither of them was powerful yet. Neither of them had the institutional authority that would define their later careers. They were young men on a plateau, looking. The friendship that developed between them in those early years would last for decades. It would shape the institutional landscape of Egyptian archaeology more completely than perhaps any other personal relationship in the discipline's modern history. And it would create, in time, one of the most structurally significant conflicts of interest in the story of the Sphinx. Not a conflict of individual dishonesty, but the quieter, more durable conflict that arises when the people responsible for deciding what gets investigated are the same people whose professional identities are most thoroughly invested in a particular answer. Zahi Hawass did not become powerful quickly. Power of the kind he eventually accumulated takes time to construct carefully, and Hawass was methodical. He earned his doctorate in Egyptology from the University of Pennsylvania in 1987. He rose through the ranks of the Egyptian Antiquities Organization, which reorganized over the years into the Supreme Council of Antiquities, with a combination of genuine scholarly ability, considerable political skill, and a gift for public communication that was, in the cloistered world of academic archaeology, essentially without precedent. He understood something that most of his contemporaries did not, that in the modern media landscape, archaeological sites are not ultimately controlled by academic seniority or publication records or the careful accumulation of field seasons. They are controlled by narrative. The scholar who shapes how the public understands a site, who becomes its face, its voice, its most visible interpreter, That scholar controls the permission structures that determine what gets excavated and what stays buried, because public perception creates political pressure, and political pressure creates or withholds the institutional authorizations that govern access. Hawass became that scholar for Giza. He was photogenic. He wore a distinctive hat that became, over time, his trademark, a kind of archaeological brand identity. He had a gift for the dramatic gesture and the well-timed revelation. He understood pacing, understood the value of the withheld answer, understood that a mystery sustained is worth more, in media terms, than a mystery solved. Television found him. He found television. The relationship was, for a time, extraordinarily productive for both parties. By the early 1990s, he was Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, the single most powerful individual in Egyptian archaeology. Every excavation permit, every research access request, every foreign team that wanted to work on Egyptian soil, every camera that wanted to film on an Egyptian site. All of it passed through his office. All of it required his approval. He was also, during this same period, navigating a relationship with the ARE and its affiliated researchers that was considerably more complicated than either party's public statements tended to acknowledge. The ARE's engagement with Hawass in the late 1980s and early 1990s was documented in their own publications and correspondence. It involved research access agreements, logistical support, and the kind of accumulated professional courtesy that, over time, creates informal obligations. Hawass was not a believer in Atlantis. He was a credentialed Egyptologist who regarded the Hall of Records hypothesis with the weary skepticism that mainstream archaeologists generally reserved for alternative theories. But he was also a pragmatist who understood that the ARE's organizational capacity and fundraising network could be useful, and that the question of what lay beneath the Sphinx, managed correctly, could generate the kind of sustained media attention that would benefit the entire project of Egyptian archaeology, which was always, in Hawass's vision of it, also the project of Egyptian national identity and cultural prestige. Handled correctly, that phrase, it carries the entire weight of what follows. In 1996, the Fox Broadcasting Company produced a live television special. It aired on a Sunday evening in March. Approximately 10 million people in the United States watched it. The title was Opening the Lost Tomb, Secrets of Ancient Egypt, and its premise was one of the most purely irresistible concepts in the history of archaeological television. Not a documentary about what had been found, but a live broadcast of the act of finding. Zahi Hawass was the host. The passage in question was real. It had been located in the Sphinx enclosure during survey work conducted in the preceding months. A shaft descending into the bedrock near the rear haunches of the monument. The shaft had not been fully explored before the cameras arrived. What it led to was not publicly known. The broadcast was structured around this genuine uncertainty, or rather around the performance of genuine uncertainty, which is not quite the same thing. The cameras descended into the shaft. Hawass narrated in the measured, authoritative tones of a man who has done this before and understands both the weight of what he is doing and the requirements of the medium in which he is doing it. The production values were high. The pacing was deliberate, slowing at each new depth. pausing before each new feature, managing the viewer's anticipation with the precision of someone who has thought carefully about how to structure a revelation. What they found on live television in front of 10 million people was a passage that descended approximately 9 meters and opened into a small chamber. The chamber contained, according to Hawas's on-camera narration, a quantity of ancient debris and sediment, some architectural features consistent with the New Kingdom tomb context, and, in one corner of the chamber, partially obscured by the accumulated debris of centuries, what appeared to be a second vertical shaft, descending further into the rock beneath the Sphinx enclosure floor. The broadcast ended. The second shaft was not explored on camera. Let that sit for a moment. 10 million people watched a live excavation that opened a passage, descended into a chamber, and found another passage going deeper, and then the credits rolled. The second shaft has not been formally reported in the peer-reviewed archaeological literature. It has not been mentioned in Hawas's subsequent publications or the reports filed with the Supreme Council that have been made available to external researchers. Based on all publicly accessible documentation, the chamber was subsequently sealed. Whether anything was done between the end of the broadcast and the sealing, whether the second shaft was explored privately, documented internally, filmed without cameras for broadcast, is not established by any available record. The Fox special was discussed in the press for several weeks after it aired, and then the specific question of what was at the bottom of that second shaft faded from public conversation, as specific questions tend to do when no one with the authority to answer them chooses to speak. Now, hold that image. A live broadcast, a descending passage, a chamber, a second shaft going deeper into the bedrock beneath the Sphinx, silence, and ask the question that the silence makes inevitable. What was at the bottom of the second shaft? There are 3 possibilities, and each one is more uncomfortable than the one before it. The first possibility is that the second shaft led to nothing significant, a natural void, a geological pocket, a dead end in the limestone that contained no artifacts, no architecture, no evidence of human presence or intention. If this is what the subsequent private investigation found, the obvious institutional response would have been to say so. A clear, authoritative statement from the Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, the most prominent and media-savvy figure in Egyptian archaeology, that the shaft had been fully explored, that it terminated in natural rock, that the chamber above it contained only the debris of a standard New Kingdom tomb context, would have been definitive. It would have disappointed the Hall of Records enthusiasts. It would have been good science. It was never made. The second possibility is that the second shaft led to something archaeologically significant but fully consistent with the established timeline. A burial chamber, a cache of ritual objects, a New Kingdom deposit of the kind that the Sphinx enclosure has yielded before. If this is what they found, the response should have been a publication, a formal report, a paper in a peer-reviewed journal documenting the finding and placing it in its proper stratigraphic and cultural context. This paper was never published. The third possibility is the one that the silence implies most forcefully, that the second shaft led to something that did not fit the established framework, something whose existence once formally documented, would require an explanation that the existing narrative of Egyptian archaeological history could not cleanly provide. This possibility cannot be proven. It cannot be confirmed or denied from the outside. But it is worth noting that the behavior of an institution that has found something anomalous, the pattern of access then silence, the decision not to report, the sealing of what was opened, is indistinguishable from the behavior of an institution that has found something it would prefer not to explain. Silence in archaeology is not neutral. It is a choice, and choices have reasons, and reasons that are never stated tend, over time, to become more interesting than the facts they were protecting. The overall pattern at the Sphinx, viewed from sufficient distance to take in its full shape, is remarkable in its consistency. It does not look like the normal operation of a bureaucratic organization navigating competing demands and limited resources. It looks like policy. Clear, consistent institutional policy applied across 4 decades, multiple governments, a revolution, a reorganization, and the terms of at least 3 different men holding the most powerful position in Egyptian archaeology. Survey teams arrive with authorization. They conduct their surveys. They detect anomalies. They file their reports. Their requests for follow-up investigation are denied. Their findings enter the scientific record and are not subsequently discussed in the forums where discussion would generate sufficient pressure to force access. 1977. Stanford Research Institute. Anomalies detected. Follow-up denied. 1978. French team. Anomalies detected. Follow-up denied. 1987. Waseda University. Anomalies detected. Follow-up denied. 1991. Dobecki and Schoch. Void confirmed in peer-reviewed publication. Follow-up denied. 1996. Fox broadcast. Passage explored on live television. Second shaft found. Follow-up. Silence. 5 separate events across 19 years. 5 separate teams and organizations. The same outcome each time. In 2009, Hawass made his most detailed public statement on the subsurface anomalies. He acknowledged the Dobecki-Schoch void. He described it as almost certainly a natural dissolution cavity in the limestone, the kind produced by groundwater moving through porous rock over geological time. He said it was not archaeologically significant. He said there was no scientific justification for drilling into it. He said there were no hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx. Schoch's response, published subsequently, did not dispute Hawass's authority to make this characterization. It disputed its factual basis. The geometry of the void, 12 meters by 9 meters, rectangular, at a consistent depth of 5 meters, with the straight-edged profile recorded by the seismic instruments, was inconsistent with natural dissolution. Natural cavities do not produce rectangular geometries. They do not maintain consistent depth profiles. They do not have the spatial regularity of a room. The instruments record return signatures. The return signatures imply geometry. The geometry implies intention. But implication, as Hawass would correctly note, is not proof. And proof requires a borehole. And the borehole has not been drilled. In 2011, the revolution came. Mubarak fell. Hawass resigned under pressure. For a brief period, a few years of institutional reorganization and political uncertainty, The grip on the plateau loosened. New access requests were filed by researchers who had been waiting for exactly this window. Some were granted. The teams that gained access used equipment considerably more sophisticated than anything available in 1991. They found the void again. The same rectangular anomaly beneath the left front paw, confirmed by instruments 30 years more advanced than Dobecki and Schoch's. They found additional anomalies in other locations across the enclosure. They mapped, with greater resolution than had ever been possible before, the complex subsurface architecture of the plateau beneath and around the monument. They published their findings. They requested follow-up excavation. The Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, the reconstituted institutional successor to the Supreme Council, denied the requests. Hawass returned to public life. The pattern resumed. The file grew thicker. The void remained a void. And beneath the politics, beneath the decades of institutional decision-making and the complicated personal histories, and the television broadcasts and the denied permits and the sealed passages, there was a geological argument that Robert Schoch had been making since 1991, an argument that had nothing to do with any of this human drama and everything to do with the stone itself, an argument about rain, about what rain does to limestone over millennia, about what the walls of the Sphinx enclosure can tell us, if we are willing to read them, about when the stone was cut and the world the carvers lived in, and, if Schoch is right, if the stone means what he says it means, then the question of what lies beneath the Sphinx becomes something considerably larger than a single void beneath a single paw. It becomes a question about the entire shape of ancient history, about whether the story we have been telling ourselves, the story in which human civilization begins in Mesopotamia and Egypt around 5,000 years ago, emerging from scattered Neolithic settlements without any significant predecessor, is the whole story. Or whether sealed in limestone at a depth of 5 meters, there's a room that remembers a different story entirely. One bore whole. 34 years of silence. There is a way to read stone, not metaphorically, literally. The surface texture of limestone, the specific pattern of its erosion, the depth and direction of its weathering channels, the way it has been shaped over time by whatever has been moving across it, carries information, geological information, the kind encoded not in words or symbols, but in the physical record of what the rock has survived and what forces have worked on it since it was exposed to the atmosphere. This information does not age. It does not fade. It does not decompose or oxidize or get buried under layers of interpretation. It is preserved in the stone itself, waiting for someone who knows the language in which it was written. Robert Schoch knows the language. He had been reading limestone for years before he came to Egypt, studying coastal geology along the New England shoreline and in other locations, documenting erosion patterns in exposed rock faces, mapping the specific signatures that different weathering agents leave in different rock types over different periods of time. His area of expertise was not ancient history or archaeological dating. It was geology, the behavior of rock under the influence of physical forces over time. He came to Egypt because Thomas Dobecki needed a geologist for the 1991 seismic survey, and Schoch was available and qualified, and the site was interesting from a geological standpoint, regardless of any archaeological implications. He was not looking for what he found, but the enclosure walls stopped him. Water moves through limestone differently than wind. Wind-driven sand abrades a rock surface horizontally, working along the face of the stone in the direction of prevailing airflow. It smooths exposed surfaces. It rounds corners. It produces a characteristic horizontal banding in sedimentary formations, following the lines of different limestone densities with the even mechanical patience of abrasion sustained over long periods. Wind erosion in a desert environment is distinctive. It is the signature of the Giza Plateau's current climate, hyper-arid, low precipitation, dominated for thousands of years by the dry northeastern winds that carry fine particulate sand across the plateau surface and against any exposed stone face. Water, specifically sustained precipitation, the kind of rainfall that falls in significant quantity over extended periods of time, erodes limestone in an entirely different way. Rain attacks the surface from above. It finds the natural fissures and microfractures in the stone and exploits them, working downward under gravity, widening cracks from the top rather than grinding surfaces from the side. Over time, sustained precipitation on exposed limestone produces a profile that geologists call a fluted or scalloped surface. Deep, rounded vertical channels separated by curved ridges, carved from above, carrying the distinctive organic asymmetry of water, finding its way through rock along the path of least resistance. The profile looks, to an educated eye, like nothing else. It does not look like wind erosion. It does not look like chemical dissolution from below. It looks exactly like what it is: rock that has been rained on, extensively, for a very long time. When Schoch examined the walls of the Sphinx enclosure in 1991, what he saw was the second kind of erosion. Not the horizontal banding of wind abrasion. Not the smooth, scoured surfaces you find on any exposed limestone face on the Giza Plateau that has been sitting in the open desert for the last 4,000 years. Deep, vertical channels, rounded, scalloped profiles, the fluted signature of sustained heavy precipitation working downward through exposed limestone over a long period of time. Rain erosion on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure. At Giza, where it has not rained significantly for approximately 5,000 years. The enclosure walls are carved from the same Mokattam limestone as the Sphinx itself. They are the vertical sides of the pit from which the monument was excavated, the raw bedrock face revealed when ancient workers cut down into the plateau to free the Sphinx from the surrounding rock. Whatever happened to the Sphinx's surface happened simultaneously to the enclosure walls. They share a weathering history. They were exposed at the same moment, by the same act of carving. Whatever has acted on them since has acted on both. If the enclosure walls show precipitation erosion, and Schoch's analysis concluded unambiguously that they do, then the enclosure walls and the Sphinx itself were exposed to substantial sustained rainfall at some point after their creation. And the last time the Giza Plateau received rainfall, substantial enough to produce that kind of erosion profile, was during what paleoclimatologists call the African humid period, the Green Sahara epoch, when orbital variations increased monsoon precipitation across North Africa, and the Sahara supported grasslands, seasonal lakes, and a climate entirely unlike the desert it would become. The African humid period ended approximately 7,000 years ago, possibly a little earlier, in the Giza region specifically. By roughly 5,000 BC, the climate had shifted to something approximating its current hyper-arid state. After that point, rainfall at Giza was too sparse and infrequent to produce significant erosion of any kind. The erosion on the Sphinx enclosure walls, therefore, was produced before 5,000 BC. Before the drying. Before the desert closed over the plateau and the rains stopped, which means the Sphinx was carved before 5,000 BC, not 2,500 BC, not the 4th dynasty, not Khafra, before 5,000 BC, possibly around 7,000 BC, possibly earlier, possibly, as Schoch's subsequent analysis would suggest, when he factored in the depth and extent of the weathering, as early as 9,000 to 10,000 BC. Sit with that for a moment, because the implications do not stay neatly contained. They cascade outward from that single geological observation, a rock face, a weathering profile, a reading of what the stone has survived, with a force that the Egyptological establishment in 1992 was neither prepared nor willing to absorb. The annual meeting of the Geological Society of America in 1992 was the first major public forum in which Schoch presented his water weathering hypothesis. He came with his data, his photographs, his analysis of erosion profiles, and his paleoclimatological correlation. He presented carefully, methodically, in the measured language of a scientist who knows that his findings are going to be contested and who has prepared accordingly. The response was immediate and, in some ways, instructive. Dr. James Harrell, a geologist who had worked in Egypt, offered the first technical rebuttal. He argued that the weathering pattern on the enclosure walls could be explained by mechanisms other than direct precipitation, by the capillary action of groundwater rising through the limestone and evaporating at the surface, by periodic flooding of the enclosure in antiquity, by the specific mineralogical properties of the Makatam limestone that might make it more susceptible to certain kinds of chemical weathering, even under arid conditions. His critique was substantive. Schoch responded to it in detail, addressing each proposed alternative mechanism and explaining why the specific erosion profile he had documented was inconsistent with each of them. The exchange between Harrell and Schoch was the scientific debate that should have happened. Two geologists arguing from evidence, proposing and contesting explanations. This is how the discipline is supposed to work. What happened next was different. Mark Lenner did not engage the geological argument. He was present at the conference, and he spoke, but his rebuttal operated on a different level entirely. He asked not whether Schoch's geological analysis was correct, but whether it could be correct, given what the archaeological record implied about the period in question. If the Sphinx was carved between 7,000 and 10,000 BC, he argued, then the civilization that carved it would have to have existed in that period. But the archaeological record of that period in the Nile Valley and surrounding region shows nothing. No cities, no administrative structures, no evidence of the organized labor and material infrastructure that carving a 73-meter monolith from living bedrock would require. Where were the settlements? Where were the tools, the quarry waste, the ceramic evidence, the burials? Where was any trace of the civilization that, on Schoch's reading, would have to have been sophisticated enough to produce the most ambitious monolithic carving in human history. It was a powerful argument. It is still a powerful argument. And it was also, structurally, a category error. Lehner was not arguing that the geological evidence was wrong. He was arguing that the geological evidence could not be right, because if it were right, then other evidence, archaeological evidence from a different discipline, would have to be wrong too. The geological argument was being evaluated not on its own empirical terms, but against the requirements of the adjacent field, which was not prepared to revise its requirements. This is not how science is supposed to adjudicate between competing hypotheses. A geological finding should be contested or confirmed on geological grounds. The absence of archaeological evidence for a culture in a given period is not, strictly speaking, evidence that the geological record of that period is misread. Absence of evidence and evidence of absence are different things, and the distinction matters when the absence in question might reflect the limitations of our excavation history, rather than the actual non-existence of what we have not yet found. Schoch acknowledged Lehner's point. He could not answer the archaeological question. He was a geologist, not an archaeologist, and the question of where the builders had gone and why they had left so little trace was genuinely beyond his data. What he could say was that the geological evidence meant what it meant, and that the appropriate response to a conflict between geological and archaeological evidence was not to dismiss one in favor of the other, but to go looking for the missing evidence, wherever it might be. The mainstream Egyptological response, in the years that followed, was not to refute him on geological grounds. No paper appeared in a peer-reviewed geological journal demonstrating that his weathering analysis was methodologically flawed, or that his paleoclimatological correlation was incorrect, or that an alternative mechanism had been identified that satisfactorily explained the specific erosion profile he had documented. No geologist published a formal rebuttal in the literature. Instead, Schoch was excluded from the conversation. He was not invited to present at major Egyptological conferences. His hypothesis was not addressed in the standard textbooks. His papers were not cited in the mainstream literature. The most effective way to contain a hypothesis that cannot be refuted on its own terms is not to defeat it, but to refuse to give it a seat at the table where the larger conversation is happening. And so the water-weathering hypothesis sat, for 20 years and more, in the uncomfortable purgatory of the formally unrefuted, institutionally ignored. Then, in 2020, something shifted. A new international research team published a comprehensive seismic survey of the Sphinx and its surrounding plateau, conducted with instruments and analytical methodologies that had not existed in 1991. The team had no affiliation with the ARE. They had no particular ideological investment in any specific outcome. They were researchers who had obtained access through standard channels, conducted their survey according to peer-reviewed protocols, and published their findings in the normal way. They found the void, the same rectangular anomaly beneath the left front paw, 12 meters by 9 meters, at a depth of approximately 5 meters, confirmed by instruments whose resolution and sensitivity made the 1991 detection look crude by comparison. The geometry had not changed because it was not a product of the instruments. It was a product of whatever is actually there. The 2020 instruments simply saw it more clearly. They also found features that the 1991 instruments had not detected: additional subsurface anomalies distributed across the Sphinx enclosure floor, beneath the Sphinx temple, in locations whose spatial relationship to one another suggested a subsurface architecture, more complex and more extensive than a single isolated void. When the 2020 data was laid over the 1991 data, and over the earlier surveys from 1977, 1978, and 1987, the accumulated picture was of a site whose underground landscape had been consistently, independently, detected across 4 decades of investigation using 5 different technological approaches, and whose investigation had been, with equal consistency, denied. The Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities did not authorize follow-up excavation. The file grew thicker. The void remained a void. Here is what the accumulated evidence implies, read as carefully and as neutrally as possible. It implies that the subsurface environment beneath and around the Sphinx is more complex than official accounts acknowledge. 5 independent detections across 43 years using different technologies by teams from different countries with different institutional affiliations, all detecting anomalies in roughly the same locations, constitutes a pattern. In standard archaeological practice, a single, peer-reviewed detection of a significant subsurface anomaly is considered sufficient to justify exploratory investigation. 5 independent detections, with 0 follow-up authorized over 4 decades, is not standard. It is extraordinary. It demands explanation. The institutional resistance to investigation is not simple bureaucratic caution. It has a history, the history of the ARE's involvement, the Cayce prophecy and its organizational infrastructure, the complicated personal and professional trajectories of the scholars who came to dominate the site, the Fox broadcast and what it found and did not report, and the geological argument that has sat unrefuted in the literature for 30 years. All of these threads converge at the same location, 12 meters by 9 meters, 5 meters down, beneath the left front paw. None of this proves the Hall of Records exists. Edgar Cayce may have been a gifted diagnostician whose historical readings were wishful extrapolation rather than genuine recovery of buried knowledge. The void may be exactly what Hawass said it was, a natural dissolution cavity that any borehole would reveal to be empty, geologically unremarkable, not worth the conservation risk the drilling would entail. The Sphinx may be exactly 4,500 years old, Khafra's monument, 4th dynasty, no predecessor. But none of it disproves any of the alternatives either. And in the silence maintained around the single investigation that would allow the evidence to resolve itself, the borehole, the camera, the human eye at depth, the impossibility of disproof has been, with a consistency that is itself a kind of data point, carefully preserved. The Sphinx faces east. It has faced east since the day the stone around it was removed, 4,500 years ago by the conservative account, 9,000 or more by Shoka's reading, and some number in between, perhaps, by whatever accounting the bedrock itself would give, if we knew how to ask it the right way. every morning, the equinoctial sunrise falls on the monument's face. The light moves across the limestone the way light always has, indifferently, without memory, without the particular quality of significance that human beings assign to the moments when old stone and morning light coincide. The Sphinx does not know it is being watched. It does not know that 5 separate teams have pressed instruments against the ground around it and listened and heard something. It does not know that a man in Virginia described its left front paw in 1932, and that 60 years later the instruments confirmed the coordinates. It holds what it holds. Beneath that face, at a depth of 5 meters, there is a space, 12 meters by 9 meters. The geometry of intention rather than accident. The geometry of a room. In that room, if it is a room, there is something. Or there is nothing. Or there was something once. It dissolved now by the same groundwater processes that Harrell suggested and that Schoch contested, returned by slow chemistry to the limestone from which it was made, leaving only the space itself as evidence of what it once contained. We cannot know which of these is true. We cannot know because we have not been permitted to look. 34 years after the instruments confirmed its existence, the void beneath the left front paw of the Great Sphinx of Giza has not been investigated. The question it represents has not been answered. The silence around it has been maintained through the tenure of multiple Egyptian governments, across a revolution, through the rise and fall and return of the most powerful individual in the history of Egyptian archaeology, so across the publication of 5 independent studies that all detected the same anomaly and all received the same institutional response. The reason for the silence is buried in the same layered sediment as everything else in this story, in the institutional decisions and the funding histories and the television broadcasts and the geological debates and the complicated personal trajectories of the scholars who came to define what is and is not permitted on the plateau. It is not a simple reason. It may not even be a single reason. It is the accumulated weight of all the reasons that pile up around a mystery, when the mystery is important enough to protect, and the protection has been in place long enough to become invisible, and the people responsible for it have told themselves, as people responsible for things they would prefer not to examine always do, that the silence is temporary, that eventually the time will be right, that the story will be told when the moment comes to tell it. The Sphinx was here before the story. It will be here after. What it holds in the dark, in the silence, in the preserved stillness of sealed limestone, at a depth of 5 meters beneath the left front paw of the most examined, most argued over, most mythologized monument on the surface of the earth. The instruments have spoken. The stone remembers the rain, and the void, 12 meters by 9, rectangular at depth, beneath the outstretched paw of a monument that may be older than civilization itself, remains exactly where the data says it is, waiting, as it has waited for 9,000 years, or 4,500, or whatever number of years the water and the stone and the silence between them have agreed to keep. Waiting for the borehole that has not been drilled, the camera that has not been lowered, the answer that has not been permitted.